Welcome to Elevate 2021. I'm your host, Mike Sear, for the session Adding New Column SQL and Objects to DataWindow at Runtime. Our session agenda: why add a column at runtime? Other ways to do it: Jerry's breadcrumbs. There was a trailblazer. The 5-step process, problems, our summary, and a Q&A. First question: why do this at all? This is primarily for use for ISVs. The idea is you have a core application. Customers always want changes to core applications. A lot of times you have extra data that they want to store. You want to be able to add some columns to some tables, have it displayed on various data windows, and also allow users to enter it and modify the data. One of our goals is to allow people to do this without having to maintain customizations for those customers between releases. So in other words, make this a very dynamic way to do this. There are a couple other options to essentially do this type of thing, but they're a lot less flexible, but they are a lot easier to do, and you've probably already done them. The other thing to consider too, and really want to make a point of this, if we're not really talking about reports, customer reports, although this would work with customer reports, in my feeling is that reports, if you do any kind of customizations on that, you just keep that as a separate report and maintain that. It's fairly easy to do. It's really more for the display and update data windows that, in my opinion, that this is a technique that's more valid for. I would actually use the other options for reports. So the other options, there's really two main ones. The typical one is to actually use Power Builder or InfoMaker, connect to your database, pull down your data window, make changes to that data window, save it off. So it's a fairly standard way of doing it. It does require Power Builder, and it also requires that Power Builder and or InfoMaker have database access. For something like Power Server, you do not have database access in most cases, particularly if you're an ISV. In some cases you might, but typically you do not. So if you do this method, once you've modified the data window, you need to do one of two things. One is to store it in some sort of a custom PBL or PBD and load that at runtime. And you would need to add that to the library list at runtime as well. Very easy to do. People have done this for years. Most Power Builder really way of deploying these types of customizations, but you do have to set that up. You do have to copy these customizations down as needed from some sort of a central location, and you have to handle all of those sorts of things yourself, unless you're using the newer Power Client, so that does help those types of situations. Again, it's not an option for Power Server. The other way of storing it is, instead of using the custom PBLs, simply store the custom data window in a database and or a file and load that at runtime. That's a lot easier in a lot of ways. It's actually the way we do reports. The cons are, of course, you must export it and store it, then retrieve it and load it at runtime. Not really a big deal, but it's something you do have to manage. The other major option is, in my opinion, sort of a cheat. You're actually just including a bunch of columns that you aren't really using in your data window. Those columns may be things like, custom column 1, custom column 2, and so forth. So it's just a generic space for somebody to store data. It's a very standard way of doing things. A lot of even non-Power Builder applications have done this for many years, so it's a pretty valid technique. If you are using stored procedures to access your data, this is pretty much your only option to do this sort of thing. You would otherwise be required to change your stored procedures at runtime and actually write your stored procedures at runtime, and typically you would not want to get anywhere near that. The problem with this option, again, is that it's not really dynamic. Columns are actually pre-selected. You also aren't allowing users to add new columns to existing tables. So really what we're looking to do here is at runtime, we're changing the data window definition. We're actually adding columns to the DataWindows SQL. We're displaying it We're also allowing it to be updatable in most cases. The advantage of this, of course, is it works with Power Server, and the big advantage, even bigger than Power Server, is that the original data window continues to work if we change it, because we're making changes to a data window that's in the application rather than storing a new one. That means the new definition, data window definition from a newer update is still taking precedence. We're applying these changes to that, so it really should continue to work without any issues at all. There might be some minor issues, but by and large, this is really going to eliminate any of your long-term maintenance requirements for customer customizations. How do we do this? I actually searched forums on a specific question many years ago, and I found somebody asking this exact question. Jerry Siegel actually responded to this question. He wrote this as a reply to that question. And what he saw was really three steps or three pieces of the whole process. In my opinion, step 3 is actually the first step, which is to change the SQL. The second step is the buffer definition changes, and the last piece is adding the visual components. A couple things he pointed out was that the ID definition in the buffer definition is pretty much your biggest issue. You really need to know how that works, and it's that fact it's basically positional, and you need to know that it's positional and sequential. So you need to match those up. That's really the big trick to the whole process to working. There is no way to change the buffer definition without actually modifying the syntax yourself. So basically you'd have to go, it's not a modify, it would basically grab the syntax, make your changes, and then recreate the data window at runtime. The other portions, changing the SQL and adding the visual column component, can both be accomplished with modifies. Again, the buffer portion cannot be. So Jerry listed three components. I think of it as really as 5 steps. First step is, again, is adding the column to the SQL syntax. Adding it to the table buffer definition is the second step. Adding the visual display if needed. It's not always needed. Sometimes you need to have the column defined, but you don't need to actually display it. And the fourth and fifth steps is really storing the changes and reapplying at runtime. The last thing we're going to sort of talk about too is how shared data interacts with this, and so the issues that you have with it, since changing the buffer breaks any shared data. So step 1, we're changing the select. So the easiest way to handle this, and in my opinion the best way to handle it, is to always define your column names with the table prefix. So it would be table dot column name. Thing you have to be aware of is that data windows have 2 modes essentially for defining the SQL. One is graphical and the other is SQL syntax. You either have to handle both or change the graphical to SQL syntax, and at runtime just handle the SQL syntax. That's the approach that we took. We just make sure that the transaction object is connected to the data window. That automatically converts it from graphical to SQL syntax, and we actually parse that as opposed to having 2 different parsers for the 2 different modes. The other thing you need to be aware of is you always need to add the column to the end of the SQL. So your new columns will be at the end of the SQL select, because again, it's positional based, and we need to make sure that the positions of the select match up with the positions that have been defined in the buffer. The next step is really just adding the buffer definition. This is actually fairly simple, with the exception of a couple things. One is you need to know the type, data window types, or the column types in order to define this. Other than that, it's simply a search and adding some code, some syntax to it, and then recreating the data window when you're done. Again, the buffer must match up, the buffer definition must match up with the SQL syntax. The last step is adding the visual component to it. Again, it's not always required. There's two ways to do this. In my opinion, one is to actually count the columns that you've been creating automatic or in the definition, as well as the automatic ones you've added yourself. If you do that, then it's essentially one way of doing it. We realized it wasn't really working well, and came up with simply doing the initial create and basically doing a describe for the column name, grabbing the idea, and then using that as a portion of the modify. And we'll go over this in more detail during the demo. So what I'm going to do is switch over to Power Builder at this point. Go. And continue there. Start it up. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to show real quick is the data window itself. This is a predefined portion. It's really got two columns. One, this is the customer code, and here's a customer name. Here's a spot for what we're going to be adding. This has been defined using graphical, and so this is what the graphical portion looks like prior to the set trans. So you can see it's has very generic SQL type Power Builder selects. So it gives you your version, which has always been 4.0.0, the table, and the column information. So fairly easy to parse, actually. So if you want to do your own parser with that, it seems pretty easy. However, after you do the set trans, you can see it converted this to actual SQL syntax, and this is what we decided to do, is to go after this, since we only have to write one parser. And again, this is the way it looks out of the box. So what this demo does is allows us to add a column. So here we're adding a city, could be anything that's already been defined on the table. So this allows us to change it. So I click the button, we'll go in the debugger portion, and we'll walk our way through here, where we're the code's actually sending in a reference to the data window, the table name, which we've essentially hard-coded in there as the customer table name, and then the column name, which is something we can actually add in that screen. And in here, then, we're going to grab the original SQL. So you can see that it's basically just the standard select from customer. We are searching for the keyword of from. If you have more complex SQL, you maybe have subselects or inline views, that sort of thing, you're going to have to write your own SQL parser, because looking simply for the from keyword is not going to cut it. But in our simple example demo here, it's going to work fine. And we're just basically looking to where to insert the new column. And so here, this is the new SQL that we've added, and so you can see we just added this to the end. And now we're going to modify the data window. So now the data window SQL has been updated, and it has the custody column in it. So that's in there. The second step, if you recall, is adding the new column to the buffer. And so what we're doing here is we're going to start out by searching the syntax for the keyword of table left parenthesis column. When we find that, then we'll start doing searches for all the predefined columns. And if you recall, there's only two in our sample data window. So go down through here, grab the syntax. So again, this is our full data window syntax. Going down through here, we're searching for the table section. And now we're going to loop through looking for all possible columns. Now, the reason that I start off with looking for the table portion is it is possible that you have a data window that doesn't have any columns defined on it. Maybe they've all been deleted or whatever. So it's, going to search for that in any case and kind of see where things are. So we went through, we found the last ones. This is what this is searching for. So there were no more of these start column syntax. So after that, we go through and we insert the new table syntax. So here's the original, and now we're inserting the new table syntax. So here you can see I've gone through and just created the type to be char4. Really what you want to do is go grab your the column definition from your table or from your database. Every database will have a slightly different, may have slightly different syntax for grabbing that information. They typically will have the old style ways of grabbing it, and most databases will have the standard ANSI schema definitions, and you can query those as well. So basically, yeah, you're going through looking to see if it's varchar or char, and then how the size of it. Whether or not you make it updatable is up to you. You may want to check to see if the table is updatable, and maybe by default you never want to make it updatable. Maybe by default you always want to. We do add the database alias here. Not quite sure how that is actually used in Power Builder, but we just add that by default. So here we've created the new syntax with the new table section, and we're going to go through and actually recreate the data window. So now the original data window has essentially been destroyed. If you have, you're going to have to reset the transaction object on it. You're going to have to, if you have any cache drop-down data windows or anything like that, you're going to have to reapply all those sorts of things. And you also have to redo any share datas. So the last step is really just creating the column display. This gets back to one of the things it gets back to is the ID. And so it's pretty simple to get the column ID because we know what the field name is. So we've defined that up above, and it was this case UA underscore for UA underscore cost city. And by grabbing doing the describe one there, we know what the ID is. Again, if the data window was changed in the next version, maybe 2 or 3 more columns were added, this ID would be pushed back from 3 to 5, and we don't have to worry about it because this is all being created dynamically at runtime, so it's not pre-built. So then we're doing the create column, give it the ID, we give it the field name. We go through and yeah, you can give things like tab sequence, your X, Y. This is actually kind of in some ways, the more detailed, difficult work, even though it's just a standard modify, but you still have to figure all this stuff out, how you want to display it. And so the last piece is, doing the modify, and it's done. So here you can see it's now displaying a city. So maybe I wanted to, instead of city, maybe I wanted to show the state. So you can do that, process through. Essentially does the same thing, except just instead of city, it's now state. And so here's some states or provinces, depending on what country you're in. And that's essentially it for the how to change the data window syntax to support all of this. So once you've essentially built some of those things, what we do is we then store the 2 components, which is in my mind it's really changing or adding the column to the SQL syntax, and then also adding the buffer and visual components as well. So when we do the customizations for this sort of thing at runtime, we actually store the window and data window class names along with the property and value. So we can basically say, okay, we're just open up this window, we go through and grab all the objects on the window, we find that, hey, this data window has some customizations defined on it, and now we can go through and grab the property names and values from the table and apply those changes to the data window. So we've done this for the SQL column definition. we just created this as our property name, so it doesn't really matter. It's just as long as your system knows what that means, that when it hits that customization, to know that it needs to go through and modify the SQL. So what we do is then is put the value of the table dot column name in there. One of the things to keep in mind is you have to do the column adds prior to anything else. So the next piece is setting up and storing the create portion. So in this case, our property value is DWO create. For the value is we have the entire create definition. The one thing we don't have in here is the name. We actually store that as along with the property. In case the name changes, it makes it pretty easy to change that. And then again, once it's been stored, you need to reapply it at runtime. So you grab the window and data window name using class name and do a retrieve on your tables of customizations and retrieve that down. Again, you must run the SQL column add first. The data window must have a transaction object set on it prior to doing this, unless your parser can handle both graphical and syntax SQL. In our case, we just go ahead and set the transaction object first. Makes it a little bit easier. So problems. A couple of main issues. Really, with the shared data is probably your biggest issue. The other issue is grids. Just sort of how adding grids is a little bit tricky for adding the headers. And shared data, again, if the shared data fails, so if you do a shared data and then change one of the data window buffers, it's going to break the shared data because we're changing the buffer. So that means you must add the same buffer to all shared data windows at runtime. So it's not enough to change the main one. You have to change all of them with this technique. And then you must do the shared data again. So you need to track all of that stuff. And the problem, of course, is that when you do the share, you don't have any, the data window itself doesn't store any information related to that's been shared and who it's been sharing, who it's shared with. So the way to work around it is to basically create your own overloaded shared data function and then store all these references to things so you know that, is it in a share, of the share master, share child, that sort of thing. And then you have to add some functions to go and grab all this information so you can go and reapply the shares and do all of the modifications at runtime, just like you do in the main ones. The other major issue is grid styles. I only say this because typically when you add a column, you also want to add some sort of label or header value, and it's usually text so that you know what it is that the column is. So doing this with grids is problematic at runtime, simply because you need to make sure your text header is in the exact spot where the in terms of the width and exposition as the column that you've added is as well. You also have to need to add it after the column's been added. So the steps are to create the column first, as we showed. So then once you do that, and this part I did not show in the demo, is that you also want to then not only do the create column, you also want to do a create text for your header label. And what we've found is it's pretty easy to do if you do the modify for, or the create first for the column, and then get the column's X value via describe, as opposed to assuming you know where it is, because a lot of times isn't. So when you create the column, if you have column value X value of 100, it may end up being 95 or 202. When it's a grid, it just sort of changes to whatever it needs to be. So when you go to create the column header text, it may not be where you think it is. So you just change the header text value to match the column's X value. I don't think you need to, but we do the same thing with the width. So figure you might as well go ahead and make the width the same as well. So again, do the header text last. So those are two of the major issues we sort of found with doing this. So again, remember, data winds are simply text files, so you can construct them really 100% at runtime. You don't have to do any of this in the IDE, really, if you don't want to. I do consider reports as sort of a separate thing. We do modify them. We will create custom ones, and they're just handled separately. We actually store them in the database, and we don't use this technical needs at all. Again, the big thing is by adding these columns, you don't have to worry about breaking future releases. You don't have to worry about maintaining user customizations. The hardest part, again, is the data window buffer, just doing that parsing. To be honest, I think the SQL parsing is probably just as hard, if not harder, if you have complex SQL. If you have really simple data window SQL syntax, that's not an issue. Then you have to make sure you get the timing correct. So you have to create certain things before others. So references. This is where the Jerry Siegel quote came from. So this was, I think, originally the question was asked, maybe one of the first forums that were on the internet that were non-CompuServe, and it just got copied down to Google Groups. And so anyway, this is a reference to that. So now it's time for Q&A.